My parents kicked me out at 18 and said, "Be grateful we fed you." So I fed them something they couldn't swallow. On the morning of my 18th birthday, I woke up to my mom pouring cold water over my face. It's time to man up and move out. I sat up instantly and saw my stepdad standing by my stuff in the doorway. They've always been cruel, but I never expected this. "But I'm your son." My mom laughed. "You've been nothing but a burden since your dad died, wasting our money on therapy, crying about nightmares." My stepdad nodded approvingly. "We kept you fed and housed for 18 years. That's more than most would do." Before I could process what was going on, they shoved my bags into my arms and literally pushed me out the door. I didn't even bother fighting. I guess part of me had already given up. After hours of prayer and petting stray cats, I found myself at a homeless shelter downtown. My hands shook as I filled out the intake forms. That's when my phone buzzed. My parents had unblocked me just to twist the knife deeper. "Mom, stop calling family saying you're homeless. You're embarrassing us." Then from my stepdad, "At least your dad had the decency to die in Afghanistan." Facepalm emoji. I lost it. Right there in that plastic chair, I just broke down sobbing. The counselor, this tired-looking woman, touched my shoulder. "Honey, what's wrong?" I showed her the texts. She was reading them when her eyes drifted down to my intake form. Her whole body went rigid. "Wait." Her voice came out strange. "Michael Krzyzewski? Your father died in Afghanistan?" "Yeah," I managed. "When I was 6. She gripped the edge of her desk. "Did you ever see the body? Attend a burial?" I stared at her in disbelief. "Excuse me, James, did anyone from the military ever visit after? Check on you?" Not really. No, I don't know. Wait, why are you asking me this?" Her hands click-clacked on her Chromebook. After 30 seconds, her face went white. "James, your father didn't die in Afghanistan." My chest tightened. "What?" "He's at Palmer V, a psychiatric ward. He's been there for 12 years. The fluorescent lights suddenly felt too bright. That's impossible. We had a funeral. I went to grief therapy for years." She looked me straight in the eyes. "You need to see your father. Today, before your parents realize you know." Suddenly, little things were clicking into place. Why Mom got nervous when military families were on TV. Why we moved states right after the funeral. I wanted to break down on the spot, but my stepdad's voice about me being a little betch echoed in my head. So instead, I took a deep breath and asked, "Why today?" Because when, not if, when, your parents find out that you know your dad is alive, then they'll know someone is coming after the benefits they've collected. She drove me to Palmer herself. The whole ride, my brain kept rejecting what was happening. But then we walked through those VA hospital doors, down a long hallway that smelled like floor wax and medicine. There he was, my father. Not the stepdad who beat me, or my mom's other secret boyfriends who tried to win me over with vintage vinyls. My dad, who loved me. "Dad?" The word came out broken. He turned, and his whole face crumpled. "James? They told me I'd never see you again. They told me you hated me. I thought you were dead." I could barely breathe. "I went to your funeral. Mom said you died a hero." His face twisted with so much pain. "They told me you knew the truth and chose them." My brain was in the middle of disassociating when my phone lit up with a notification. While I sat here learning my entire life was built on lies, my parents took the opportunity to drain my college savings, my birthday money, everything. Account closed. I dropped my phone on the floor and my dad picked it up and read the screen. "All my combat pay went to you," he said quietly. "Every month for 12 years. For your future." I never saw a penny. A doctor walked in. "Mr. Krzyzewski has been ready for discharge for years, but he's disabled from the war. He needs family to release him to. Someone who will take care of him." "I'll do it," I said immediately. "I'll take care of him." The next morning felt unreal. Dad walked out in civilian clothes, jeans, and a flannel that hung loose on him. As we got closer to my mom and stepdad's home, his breathing got shallow. 12 years, Dad whispered. 12 years they stole from us. We stood at the front door, the same door they'd pushed me out of yesterday. Inside, footsteps approached. The deadbolt turned. The door swung open. We were met with my stepdad's face. It dropped so quickly I almost laughed. He was seeing a dead man standing on his porch. Behind him, Mom appeared, and her coffee mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. My dad smiled. "Hello, Mark. We need to talk about my death benefits. Listen to 90 Seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card." Mark's face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. First shock, then this weird calculation like he was trying to figure out if this was real, then anger that turned his whole face red. Mom made this small choking sound, and her coffee mug just slipped right out of her hand. It hit the hardwood floor and exploded into pieces. Brown coffee splattered across the white tile in the entryway. The sound of it breaking felt perfect somehow, like their lies were shattering right there with the ceramic. Mark found his voice first and started yelling about how we couldn't just show up here. He said we were trespassing and making crazy accusations. His voice got louder with each word. Mom switched tactics so fast it would have been impressive if it wasn't so sick. Her whole face went soft and concerned. She looked at Dad with these fake worried eyes and asked if he was taking his medications. She said maybe he was confused about what really happened. She used this gentle voice like she was talking to a confused child. I felt my hand moving to my pocket before I even decided to do it. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. I held it low by my side but angled up so the microphone would catch everything. I kept my face neutral and let them keep talking. Mark noticed after maybe 30 seconds. His eyes locked onto my phone and he lunged forward. His hand reached out to grab it. Dad stepped between us even though his hands were shaking, so bad I could see them trembling from where I stood. Mark stopped. He looked past Dad to the street where a neighbor was getting their mail. His face changed again, and he backed up a step. I kept recording. Mom tried a different approach and said we should all sit down and talk calmly inside. Dad's breathing changed. It got fast and shallow. I could see his chest moving too quick. His eyes had this unfocused look that I recognized from the hospital. He was starting to spiral. I made the choice right there. We came here to let them know we weren't going away. That message got delivered. I touched Dad's arm and said we were leaving. He nodded but didn't say anything. We turned and walked back to the car. I could feel Mom and Mark watching us from the doorway. I got Dad into the passenger seat, and he just stared down at his hands. They were still shaking. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute trying to figure out what to do next. Then I remembered the shelter counselor had given me her direct number. I called her and explained what just happened. She didn't waste time with questions. She said she could arrange a one-night motel voucher through an emergency fund. She gave me the address and said to ask for the manager. I thanked her and hung up. Dad hadn't moved. He was still looking at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I started the car and drove to the motel. It took 20 minutes. Dad didn't speak the whole way. The weight of being the only thing between him and complete breakdown sat on my chest like a rock. The motel was called the Sunset Inn, even though there was no sunset view anywhere. Just a parking lot and a highway. The manager gave us the key to room 107 without much conversation. The room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning spray. There were 2 beds with brown covers, and a desk by the window with a scratched surface. I spread everything out on that desk. Dad's discharge papers from Palmer, my birth certificate that I'd grabbed from my room before they kicked me out, screenshots of the texts from Mom and Mark, the bank notification about my drained account. I lined it all up in rows. It wasn't much, but organizing it made me feel slightly less like I was drowning. I took pictures of everything with my phone. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and called the number on the bank notification. The fraud department put me on hold for 15 minutes. Finally, someone picked up. I explained the situation. The representative said my college savings account was closed yesterday morning. All the funds got transferred to an account I didn't have access to. She said I would need to file a police report. I would also need documentation proving the money was mine. When I asked how to prove that when I'm homeless and barely holding it together, her voice got quieter. She said she understood this was hard, but those were the requirements. She gave me a case number and said to call back once I had the police report. I wrote the number down on the motel notepad. My hand was shaking. Dad spoke for the first time since we left the house. He said when he enlisted, he set up something called an allotment. His combat pay would go directly to support his family. He didn't understand all the technical details of how it worked. He just wanted to make sure we would be taken care of if anything happened to him. His voice had this guilt in it that made my throat tight. He said he thought that money was going to me all these years. For my future. For college. I told him I never saw any of it. He put his face in his hands. Something broke in me watching that. This man who served his country and got locked away and lost 12 years with his son, feeling guilty because he tried to take care of me, and it got stolen. I wanted to say something to make it better, but there weren't any words for this. I just sat next to him on the bed until his breathing evened out. I spent the next hour backing up everything on my phone to the cloud. The shelter counselor told me that documentation was everything when you're fighting people with more resources than you. I created a folder labeled Evidence. I uploaded screenshots of every text message, the voice recording from the porch, photos of every document spread out on the desk. I made sure everything saved in 3 different places. My phone storage, Google Drive, email drafts. I wasn't going to lose this stuff because my phone died or got stolen or Mom and Mark found some way to delete it. Every screenshot felt like a small piece of protection. Every backed up file was something they couldn't take away from me. The next morning, we drove back to Palmer, Virginia. Dad needed a replacement ID with a current address. We also needed printouts of his benefits history. The discharge coordinator was a woman maybe 50 years old with reading glasses on a chain. She was helpful, but moved at the pace of someone who processes paperwork all day, every day. She asked Dad questions and typed his answers with 2 fingers. She printed forms and had him sign them. She said the ID would take 2 weeks to process. The benefits history would be ready this afternoon. I sat in the plastic chair and practiced patience. My brain was screaming that we needed answers faster, that every day was another day Mom and Mark could be hiding money or destroying records, but I kept my mouth shut and waited. The coordinator finished the forms and gave us a number to call this afternoon for the printouts. We thanked her and left. In the car, Dad said he was tired. I drove us back to the motel. He laid down on one of the beds and fell asleep almost immediately. I sat at the desk and stared at the organized documents. We had taken the first steps. We had confronted them. We had started documenting everything. We had begun the process of getting Dad's identity back. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close to enough. But it was something. And something was more than I had 2 days ago when I woke up to cold water on my face. The next morning, I dug through the papers until I found the VA benefits phone number and dialed it. The automated system made me press numbers for different departments, and I got transferred 3 times before landing in a queue with hold music that sounded like it was recorded in 1987. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the desk while I organized documents. 20 minutes passed, then 40. Dad woke up and shuffled to the bathroom, and I was still listening to the same 30-second loop of elevator music. Finally, a woman's voice came on and asked for Dad's social security number. I read it off the discharge papers. She asked what I needed help with, and I tried to explain about representative payees and power of attorney, but the words came out jumbled. She was patient, though, and started from the beginning. She explained that a representative payee is someone appointed to manage benefits for a person who can't manage them alone. That person has to apply and get approved by the VA. She said someone had been receiving Dad's benefits for years under that arrangement. I asked who, and she said she couldn't tell me that information over the phone without proper authorization. I felt stupid for not understanding all the acronyms she was using. POA and RPP and VARO and things I'd never heard of. I grabbed the motel notepad and started writing everything down, but my handwriting was messy because my hand was shaking. She explained the process for changing a representative payee and said I'd need to file specific forms and Dad would need to be evaluated. The whole conversation took an hour, and when I hung up, my brain felt full of information I barely understood. I called the shelter counselor and told her about the VA call. She said she wanted to connect me with Adult Protective Services because what my parents did might be financial exploitation of a disabled veteran. I hesitated. Mom had spent years teaching me that government agencies were traps that made things worse, and you couldn't trust them. The counselor must have heard something in my silence because she said sometimes the system is the only protection you have. I thought about that. About how the system had already helped me find Dad when I didn't even know to look. About how I couldn't fight Mom and Mark alone with no money and no home. I said okay, and she gave me a number to call and a name to ask for. Giovanni Mercier. She said he handled cases like this, and he was good at his job. I thanked her and wrote down the information. Before I made that call, I tried something else. I went through my phone contacts and found numbers for family members I barely remembered. Aunts and uncles and cousins from before we moved states. Most of the numbers were disconnected. 3 went to voicemail, and I left messages explaining what happened and asking if they'd talk to me. 2 rang, but nobody answered. Then I called Aunt Lisa, my mom's sister. She picked up on the 4th ring. I started to explain who I was, and she cut me off. She said she'd already heard from my mother that I was spreading lies and trying to make them look bad. She said she didn't want to get involved in family drama. I tried to tell her about Dad being alive, but she talked over me. She said Mom had been through enough losing her husband and raising me alone, and I should be grateful instead of causing trouble. Then she hung up. I sat there staring at my phone. The isolation felt deliberate, like Mom had spent years cutting off anyone who might question her story or help me if I ever found out the truth. That night after Dad fell asleep, I opened a new document on my phone and started writing everything I could remember. I put Dad's supposed death at the top and marked it as when I was 6. Then I listed everything that happened after. How we moved to a different state within months of the funeral. How Mom got nervous whenever military families appeared on TV shows. How she always changed the subject fast when I asked about Dad's service or wanted to look at photos of him. How she threw out most of his stuff during the move and said it was too painful to keep. How we never visited the grave she claimed he was buried in. I wrote down the therapy sessions where I cried about losing him. The nightmares I had for years. The way Mom used my grief to control me and make me feel guilty for being sad. Writing it all out made the patterns visible. It wasn't just one lie. It was a whole structure of lies built carefully over 12 years, each piece designed to keep me from asking the right questions. My phone lit up at midnight, a text from Mom. It said we could talk if I stopped spreading rumors and making her look bad to the neighbors. She said people were asking questions, and it was embarrassing her. She said I was being dramatic, and we could work this out if I just calmed down and came home. I read it 3 times. My thumb moved toward the reply button, and I caught myself. I stared at the message for 20 minutes. Part of me wanted to type back all the things I was feeling, but I knew that's what she wanted. She wanted me to engage so she could twist my words and make me feel crazy. Instead, I took a screenshot of the text. I opened my evidence folder and added it to the collection. Then I put my phone face down on the desk without responding. The next morning, I sat down with Dad while he ate the free motel breakfast I'd brought back to the room. I said we needed to talk about boundaries and safety. He looked up at me with this expression like he was bracing for bad news. I explained that Mom and Mark might try to contact him, and he couldn't tell them where we were staying or what we were doing. He nodded, but didn't say anything. I kept going. I said they might try to convince him I was lying, or that I was going to abandon him. I said no matter what they said, he couldn't share information with them. He agreed, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The same fear I'd seen at Palmer when he thought I might leave him there. I reached across the small table and put my hand on his arm. I promised him I wasn't going anywhere. I said we were going to figure this out together, and I meant it. His shoulders relaxed a little, and he went back to eating. I had an appointment at Legal Aid that afternoon. The office was in a strip mall next to a tax preparation place. Inside, it smelled like old coffee and copy machine toner. The receptionist had me fill out an intake form and then led us to a small office where Artemisia Bruno was waiting. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30 with dark hair pulled back and glasses. She shook both our hands and gestured for us to sit. Then she opened a yellow legal pad and said to start from the beginning. I told her everything, about waking up to cold water on my birthday, about the shelter counselor finding Dad, about the confrontation on the porch, about the drained bank accounts. She didn't interrupt once, just wrote notes in neat handwriting and nodded occasionally. When I finished, she looked up at me. She said we had potential civil claims for fraud and conversion. She explained those were legal terms for lying to steal money and taking property that belonged to someone else. She said there was also a criminal angle if the district attorney's office got involved. She asked if I had documentation, and I showed her my phone with all the screenshots and recordings. She said that was good, that I was smart to preserve everything. Then she said this was going to take time, but she would help us. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man said his name was Giovanni Mercier from Adult Protective Services. He said the shelter counselor had referred my case, and he wanted to schedule a phone intake. I grabbed my notepad. He asked questions about Dad's situation, and I answered as clearly as I could. He said he was opening a case file and assigning an investigator. He explained the process would take time because they needed to interview multiple parties and gather financial records. I felt my impatience rising. I wanted answers now. I wanted Mom and Mark punished now, but Giovanni's voice was calm and steady, and he said thorough investigation was better than quick dismissal. I knew he was right, even though it frustrated me. He said someone would call within a week to schedule interviews, and I should keep documenting everything. The next call came from the bank. A woman named Agatha Riggs from the fraud department. She said she'd received my initial report and was creating a case file. Then she started listing documents they would need. A police report, proof of my identity, evidence the account was set up for my benefit, statements from anyone who could verify my parents' access wasn't authorized. I wrote everything down, but each requirement felt like another mountain to climb. I didn't have some of these things. I didn't know how to get others. Agatha must have sensed my stress because she said to take it one step at a time. She said to get what I could and call her back. She gave me her direct number and said she was assigned to my case specifically. That afternoon, Ricardo Bruno from the VA called. He said he was a social worker, and he wanted to schedule a consultation about housing assistance and caregiver programs. He also said we needed to talk about changing Dad's representative payee. He started naming programs and resources I'd never heard of. HUDVASH and caregiver stipends and something called aid and attendance. I grabbed my notepad again and wrote as fast as I could, but he was talking quickly, and I was missing things. He must have noticed because he slowed down and said he'd email me information about everything. Then he asked when we could meet in person. I looked at Dad sitting on the bed watching TV and felt something loosen in my chest. Relief, maybe, or hope. Someone was actually helping us. Someone who knew how the system worked and wanted to guide us through it. I scheduled the meeting for the following week, and when I hung up, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. The next morning, I met Artemisia at the legal aid office, and she helped me draft a formal request to Peaceful Rest Funeral Home. I gave her the address Mom had taken me to 12 years ago for the memorial service. Artemisia explained we needed official confirmation of what services they actually provided versus what Mom claimed happened. She typed up the request on legal aid letterhead, and I signed it. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the motel. I opened it with Dad watching from the bed. The funeral home director wrote that they provided memorial service space on the date in question, but never received any remains for burial or cremation. Their records showed no casket purchase, no burial plot, no cremation authorization. Just the rental of their chapel for 2 hours. I read it twice and my stomach turned. I already knew Dad was alive, but seeing it in writing that the whole funeral was empty theater made me feel sick in a different way. That afternoon, I drove to the police station downtown and asked to file a report. The officer at the front desk directed me to Detective Hugo Larkin's office. He was maybe 50 with gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on his head. I sat in a plastic chair across from his desk while he pulled up a form on his computer. He asked me to start from the beginning, so I told him everything. About waking up to cold water on my 18th birthday, about finding Dad alive at Palmer, about my drained bank accounts and 12 years of stolen benefits. Hugo typed steadily, without interrupting. When I finished, he printed the report and had me review it for accuracy. He explained this would take time to investigate. Financial crimes involving multiple parties and federal benefits were complex, but the report number would help me with the bank and other agencies. He handed me a business card and told me to call if I remembered additional details or if my parents contacted me. I folded the report and put it in my evidence folder. 2 days later, I was sitting on the motel bed organizing paperwork when I glanced out the window. Mark's truck was parked 3 spots down. He was just sitting there behind the wheel staring at our room. My whole body went cold. I grabbed my phone and called 911 first. Then I started throwing our stuff into bags. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the zippers. Dad asked what was wrong and I pointed out the window. His face went white. The dispatcher stayed on the line while I packed. She said officers were 5 minutes out. I kept watching Mark through the curtain. He hadn't moved, just sitting there watching us. When the police arrived, Mark drove away slowly. The officers took a report and told me to document any future contact. After they left, I sat on the floor with my back against the bed. Dad put his hand on my shoulder. We decided to keep our bags packed from now on, just in case. The next day, Artemisia helped me request my school records from the district office. She explained we needed documentation showing the grief therapy Mom had me in for years. The records arrived a week later, and I spread them across the motel desk. Page after page of counseling session notes from ages 6 to 16. Every single one listed the diagnosis code for loss of parent. The therapist's notes documented my ongoing trauma over Dad's supposed death, how I cried about missing him, how I had nightmares about the funeral, how Mom told the therapist I needed help processing my father's combat death. Each session was billed to my parents' insurance with that same diagnosis code. Reading through years of my own grief written up in clinical language created this weird distance, like I was reading about someone else's pain. But it also created a paper trail proving how long and deliberately Mom and Mark maintained the lie. Artemisia sent formal preservation letters the following week. One went to the bank. One went to my parents' address. The letters used legal language requiring them not to destroy any documents or records related to Dad's benefits or my accounts. Artemisia explained this was standard procedure before filing a lawsuit. If they destroyed evidence after receiving this letter, they could face additional penalties. She said the formal legal language was powerful. It put them on notice that we were building a case, and they needed to preserve everything. When I read the letter before she mailed it, I felt something shift. For weeks, I'd been reacting to what they did. Now, we were taking action, making them respond to us instead of the other way around. Agatha called 3 days later with an update. She said the bank's fraud investigation had identified a pattern, transfers from Dad's benefits account to a joint account controlled by Mom and Mark going back years. She was flagging the transactions as suspicious and building a timeline, but she warned me that proving the transfers were unauthorized would require more documentation. We needed records from the VA showing Dad never authorized Mom as his representative. We might need court orders to access certain accounts. She said the bank was taking this seriously, but the investigation would take time. I wrote down everything she said and added it to my notes. Each piece of evidence felt like another brick in the wall we were building. The VA called that same week to schedule an interview with Dad. Ricardo explained they were reviewing Dad's representative payee arrangement. They needed to interview him alone, without family present, to ensure he could express his wishes freely. The appointment was set for the following Tuesday at the VA clinic. Ricardo said this was standard procedure when there were concerns about a payee's authority. They wanted to hear directly from Dad what he wanted and who he trusted to manage his benefits. I felt hopeful for the first time in weeks. Someone was finally centering what Dad actually wanted instead of what other people decided for him. Dad was nervous about the interview, but I helped him practice answering questions clearly. Giovanni called me 2 days later. He said he'd conducted a home visit to Mom and Mark's house as part of the APS investigation. They were cooperative and claimed they had proper power of attorney to manage Dad's affairs while he was hospitalized. Giovanni said they seemed prepared with documents and explanations, but he was requesting copies of everything they showed him to verify authenticity. He explained that people who commit financial exploitation often have paperwork that looks legitimate at first glance. His job was to dig deeper and confirm whether their authority was actually valid. He said the investigation was ongoing and he'd update me as he learned more. After we hung up, I felt frustrated. Of course, Mom and Mark seemed cooperative. They'd been lying successfully for 12 years. The following week, Artemisia received copies of the alleged power of attorney through discovery demands. She called me to her office and spread the document across her desk. I looked at the signature line where Dad supposedly signed over authority to Mom. Even to my untrained eye, it looked wrong. The letters were shaky and uneven, nothing like Dad's signature on his current VA documents or the forms we'd been filling out together. The date was from 13 years ago, right after Dad was first hospitalized. Artemisia pointed out several other problems with the document. The notary seal looked faded. The witness signatures were barely legible. She said we might need a handwriting expert to prove it was forged, but even without that, the document raised serious questions. Dad and I went to the DMV the next morning to get him a state ID. Ricardo had helped us set up a VAPO box we could use for official mail since the motel wasn't permanent. We filled out the application, and Dad handed over his discharge papers and social security card for verification. The clerk processed everything and said the ID would be ready in 20 minutes. We sat in plastic chairs waiting. When they called Dad's name, he walked up to the counter, and the clerk handed him a temporary paper ID with his photo. Dad stared at it for a long moment. His name, his current address for the first time in 12 years, not the hospital, not Mom and Mark's house, our address. I watched him fold it carefully and put it in his wallet. It was such a small thing, just a piece of paper with his information, but it felt like a tiny victory in a war we were still losing. Ricardo called that afternoon while we were back at the motel. He asked if I had time to go over the VA caregiver program application, and I said yes immediately. He walked me through each section on the phone, explaining what medical records I needed from Dad's Palmer file and which forms required a doctor's signature. The application asked for detailed information about Dad's daily care needs, his disabilities, his treatment plan. I filled in boxes about medication management, appointment attendance, meal preparation, emotional support. Every question made the weight of what I'd taken on feel more real. Ricardo sent me links to the required training modules, and I started the first one that evening, watching videos about veteran mental health and caregiver burnout. The training talked about setting boundaries and asking for help, which felt strange when I was 18 and had no idea what I was doing. I submitted the completed application through the VA portal, and Ricardo confirmed he received it, then explained the approval process could take several weeks, but he'd follow up to keep things moving. The shelter counselor had referred me to Amelia Fletcher at the community mental health clinic, and I went to my first appointment 2 days later. The clinic was in a converted house with mismatched furniture in the waiting room and motivational posters on the walls. Amelia called me back, and I followed her to a small office that smelled like lavender. She was maybe 40, with glasses and a calm way of moving that made the room feel safer. She asked what brought me in, and I started explaining about my parents kicking me out and finding Dad and the stolen money, and halfway through I realized I was talking too fast and my hands were shaking. She didn't interrupt or try to fix anything, just listened and took occasional notes. When I finished, she asked how I was sleeping and eating, and I admitted I wasn't doing great with either. She said we'd work on coping skills and processing the trauma, but for now she just wanted me to know I had a place to talk about it. The session was only 50 minutes, but leaving felt like I'd set down something heavy, at least temporarily. Agatha from the bank called to schedule a detailed interview, and I met her at the branch office the following week. She had printouts of every transaction on my old savings account going back 5 years, highlighted and annotated with sticky notes. We went through each withdrawal and transfer, with Agatha asking who initiated it, what I was told it was for, whether I gave permission. I explained that Mom always said the money was saved for college, that I never had access to the account myself, that I didn't know she could just close it whenever she wanted. Agatha asked about the joint account structure, and I told her it was set up when I was 13, that Mom said it was normal for parents to be on their kids' accounts. She made notes about everything, and explained the bank had standards for provisional credit in fraud cases. My situation was complicated because the account was technically joint, but the pattern of access and the timing of the final withdrawal, right when I discovered Dad was alive, created a strong case. She said she'd present everything to the fraud review committee and get back to me within 2 weeks. Giovanni called a few days later about arranging a DNA test. He explained that to shut down any argument from Mom and Mark about my standing in Dad's case, we needed definitive biological proof. The test would be through an approved lab, and the results would go into the official APS file. I agreed, even though something about it felt wrong, like I had to prove my own family. We went to the lab the next morning, and a technician swabbed the inside of my cheek, then Dad's, and labeled the samples with case numbers. The whole thing took 10 minutes. Walking out, I felt angry that this was necessary, that 12 years of lies meant I had to scientifically verify I was my father's son. Dad was quiet in the car, and I knew he felt it too, this invasive proof of something that should have just been true. Artemisia called me into the legal aid office for an update. She'd drafted an emergency motion for temporary control of specific accounts, arguing that Mom and Mark's ongoing access created risk of further asset disappearing. The motion requested the court freeze certain accounts and require financial reporting while the investigations continued. We had a hearing date in 2 weeks. Artemisia spread the paperwork across her desk and walked me through what to expect. She said court was unpredictable and stressful, that judges had a lot of discretion, that we might not get everything we asked for. But this was our best shot at stopping them from hiding or spending more money while APS and the police did their work. I signed the verification forms, and she filed everything electronically that afternoon. The funeral home sent additional records 2 days later. I opened the envelope at the motel and pulled out invoices and contracts showing they'd provided space for a memorial service. Nothing more. No cremation services, no burial services, no handling of remains. Just a room rental and some chairs and a guest book. I stared at the papers trying to process that the funeral I remembered, the casket I cried over, the entire ceremony was theater. Mom and Mark had staged a memorial service for a man who was alive 20 miles away in a VA hospital. I felt something crack open inside me, this cold rage that made my hands shake. I told Dad I needed to walk, and I left the motel, circling the parking lot and the nearby streets for over an hour until my legs hurt and the anger settled into something I could carry. Ricardo called about HUDVASH screening for Dad. The program provided housing vouchers and case management for homeless veterans, and Dad qualified based on his service and current situation. The screening interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the VA clinic. Dad got anxious as soon as Ricardo explained the process, worried they'd think he was too damaged or didn't deserve help. That evening I sat with him, and we practiced answering the questions Ricardo said they'd ask. I reminded him he'd served his country, that he'd earned this support, that being honest about his needs wasn't weakness. We went over it until he could talk about his mental health and housing situation without his voice shaking too much. An email arrived at the legal aid office from Mom's personal account. Artemisia forwarded it to me with a note to call her. I read the whole thing, this long, rambling message about grief and confusion, and how she'd always planned to tell me the truth when I was older. She blamed the trauma of thinking she might lose Dad, said she made bad decisions out of fear, claimed she never meant to hurt anyone. The email went on for pages, without ever actually admitting what she'd done or apologizing for specific actions. Artemisia called me that afternoon and said it was a classic non-apology, the kind that admits nothing concrete and keeps all the blame vague. She'd already responded officially, stating that all communication needed to go through attorneys from now on. I felt relieved that I didn't have to figure out how to respond myself, that someone was running interference, so Mom couldn't manipulate me directly. Artemisia brought up the possibility of hiring a handwriting expert to analyze the power of attorney signature. She explained that experts were expensive, usually several $1,000s, and we should wait to see if the bank's internal review flagged the document first. If the bank's analysts found problems with the signature, that would give us ammunition without the cost. I wanted answers immediately, but I was learning that legal strategy sometimes meant patience, waiting for the other side to make mistakes instead of forcing every issue. Artemisia said she'd keep pushing on multiple fronts, and we'd decide about the expert once we saw how the bank review went. Dad and I started building a daily routine to keep ourselves from spiraling. Every morning I set out his medications in a pill organizer, and we took them together with breakfast. Then we spent an hour on paperwork and phone calls, following up with agencies, organizing documents, checking email. After that, we took a short walk around the motel parking lot, just 10 or 15 minutes to get outside and move. The structure helped both of us feel less out of control. I noticed Dad's anxiety decreased when he knew what to expect each day, when there was a plan instead of just reacting to whatever crisis came next. Some days the routine felt boring, and I wanted to rush ahead to solutions, but I was learning that stability came from small, consistent things, not dramatic breakthroughs. Giovanni's call came on a Thursday morning while I was sorting Dad's medications into the weekly organizer. He said APS completed their preliminary review and substantiated concerns about financial exploitation, that the investigation would continue, but this initial finding validated everything we'd been saying. I asked what that meant for the criminal case, and he explained it wasn't a final determination, but it gave Detective Hugo solid ground to work from, that official documentation of abuse would strengthen both the criminal investigation and our civil suits. I thanked him and hung up, then sat there staring at the pill organizer, because after weeks of feeling like maybe I was making too big a deal out of this, Someone official was saying it actually happened, that what Mom and Mark did was real abuse with a paper trail to prove it. The bank called 2 hours later, and Agatha walked me through their internal review findings, how their analysts flagged the power of attorney's signature as potentially forged based on comparison with Dad's other documents on file. She said they were placing holds on any further withdrawals from Dad's benefits account while they completed their investigation, that this didn't get our money back yet, but it stopped Mom and Mark from draining more while we built the case. I asked how long the review would take, and she said probably another few weeks, that these things moved slowly, but the holds were immediate and enforceable. Dad asked what was happening, and I explained both calls, watching his face shift from confusion to something like hope, like maybe the system actually worked sometimes, instead of just crushing people who couldn't fight back. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Monday at the county courthouse, and Artemisia met us in the lobby 30 minutes early to go over what would happen. She said the judge would hear from both sides, review the police report about Mark showing up in our parking lot, and decide whether to grant the order or dismiss it. We walked through security and sat on a bench outside the courtroom, Dad's leg bouncing the whole time, and then Mark actually showed up with some lawyer in a cheap suit. My stomach dropped because I'd half convinced myself he wouldn't bother, that he'd just let the order go through, but there he was, looking self-righteous and angry. The bailiff called our case, and we filed into the courtroom, Mark and his lawyer on one side, and us with Artemisia on the other. The judge asked Mark's lawyer to present first, and the guy claimed Mark never threatened us, that he was just checking on family after a difficult situation, and we were overreacting. Artemisia stood up and walked the judge through the police report, the documented pattern of harassment, the timing of Mark's appearance right after we started legal proceedings. The judge read through the report for what felt like forever, then looked at Mark and asked if he had any legitimate reason to be in our parking lot at night. Mark started talking about family obligations, and the judge cut him off, said the evidence showed a pattern of intimidation, and granted a limited order requiring Mark to stay 500 feet away from us for 6 months. We walked out, and I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment, because 6 months felt both like protection and like not enough, but Artemisia said it was a solid win, and any violations would mean jail time. The VA scheduled Dad's representative payee interview for Wednesday, and we drove over to Palmer for the appointment. A social worker I hadn't met before brought Dad into an office alone, and I sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes checking my phone every 2 minutes. When Dad came out, he looked tired, but okay, said they asked who he wanted managing his benefits, and he told them me without hesitating. The social worker called me in after and explained there was a process, that I'd need to complete training modules and submit paperwork, but Dad's clear statement of preference carried significant weight in their decision. She handed me a folder with training information and said they'd be in touch about next steps, that the goal was to finalize everything within a month. I thanked her, and we left, Dad quiet in the passenger seat, and finally he said he was scared I'd think it was too much responsibility and back out. I told him I wasn't going anywhere, that we were doing this together, and he nodded, but I could see he didn't quite believe it yet, after 12 years of people abandoning him. Ricardo called Thursday afternoon to say Dad passed the HUD-VASH eligibility screening, and we were approved to start looking for a unit. He connected me with Augusto Carney, the housing coordinator, who explained we needed a 1-bedroom that met program standards, and the voucher would cover most of the rent. Augusto said he'd send me listings that qualified, and we could schedule viewings once I found places I wanted to see. I hung up and told Dad we were approved for real housing, not just motel vouchers, and he asked how much it would cost us. I explained the voucher covered most of it, and we'd only pay a small portion, that this was the first piece of actual stability we'd had since everything started. He got quiet again, and I realized he was crying, just sitting there with tears running down his face, and I didn't know what to say, so I just sat next to him until he pulled himself together. Friday. I spent the whole afternoon on my laptop updating Dad's mailing address with every agency I could think of. Social Security, the VA, his bank, his pharmacy, his insurance company, each one with its own form and verification process. Ricardo helped me set up a VAPO box as our permanent address until we had stable housing, explaining it would prevent any issues with mail during the transition. Each form I submitted felt like I was erasing another piece of Mom and Mark's control, changing every link they had to Dad's information and benefits. My hand cramped from typing and my eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I kept going because this tedious administrative work was how you actually protected someone, not through dramatic confrontations, but through paperwork and documentation. The bank called Monday morning, and Agatha said they were issuing a small provisional credit to a new student account they'd helped me open, completely separate from anything my parents had touched. She warned it was only a fraction of what was stolen and could be reversed if their investigation didn't support my claims, so I needed to be careful spending it on anything except absolute necessities. The deposit hit Tuesday, and I stared at the balance for a full minute. This small amount of money that was actually mine and couldn't be taken away without warning. I used some of it to buy groceries, real food instead of whatever the motel voucher covered, and Dad helped me cook dinner in the tiny kitchenette. Wednesday, a message came through on social media from someone claiming to be my mom's cousin, saying the family wanted to arrange a meeting to work things out before this got more complicated. I read it 3 times looking for the manipulation angle and found it in the phrase, "before this got more complicated," like the problem was me pursuing legal action instead of them stealing from us for 12 years. I sent a screenshot to Artemisia, and she drafted a response saying all contact needed to go through legal counsel, that we weren't meeting with anyone without attorneys present. Hitting send on that message felt powerful, even though it made me sad that family had to work this way, that I couldn't trust anyone on Mom's side to actually care about what happened to us. Artemisia called Thursday to propose a settlement conference before filing a full lawsuit, explaining that litigation was expensive and slow, and if we could get restitution and accountability through negotiation, it might be better than years in court. I said I didn't think Mom and Mark would ever take real responsibility, that they'd just make excuses and try to minimize what they did. She agreed that was likely, but said the pragmatic approach was to try settlement first, that we could always file suit if they refused to negotiate in good faith. I told her to set it up, but I wasn't expecting anything good to come from it. The DNA results arrived Friday in a plain envelope, and I opened it already knowing what it would say. The test confirmed I was Dad's biological son with 99.9% certainty, shutting down any possible argument that I wasn't entitled to be involved in his care or pursue claims on his behalf. Giovanni called an hour later to say he'd received the results and was filing them with APS as part of the official record, one more piece of documentation proving our relationship and my legal standing. I filed the report in our evidence folder and added it to the cloud backup, this proof of something I'd never doubted, but that the system required me to verify anyway. 3 days after the DNA results arrived, Ricardo called while I was making breakfast in the motel kitchenette. He said the VA finished reviewing Dad's representative payee change, and it was pending final approval within the next 2 weeks. They placed interim holds on the account to stop any unauthorized access during the transition, which meant Mom and Mark couldn't touch anything while the paperwork processed. I asked what happens once it's approved, and Ricardo explained I'd have legal authority to manage Dad's benefits, full control over the money that was supposed to support us all these years. Dad was sitting at the tiny table listening to my side of the conversation, and when I hung up and told him what Ricardo said, his hands started shaking. I reached across and held them steady until he nodded and took a breath. The settlement conference happened the following Tuesday at Legal Aid, in a small conference room with a scratched table and flickering overhead lights. Artemisia sat next to me with her laptop open and 3 folders of documentation stacked in front of her. Mom arrived first with her attorney, a middle-aged guy in a wrinkled suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mom's eyes were already red and puffy, like she'd been crying in the car, and when she saw me, she reached out like she wanted to hug me, but I just stared at her until she sat down. Mark showed up 10 minutes late without a lawyer, dropping into a chair and immediately starting in about how this whole thing was a misunderstanding, and we were making him look bad at work. Artemisia ignored him completely and opened the first folder, laying out bank statements showing the pattern of transfers from Dad's benefits to their joint account. Mom's attorney shifted in his seat and started taking notes. Artemisia walked through each document methodically, her voice calm and factual, pointing out dates and amounts and the timeline of when Dad was hospitalized versus when the transfers started. Mom kept interrupting with excuses about how confused she was after losing her husband and how she thought she was doing the right thing. Mark got louder, insisting they had power of attorney and everything was legal, but Artemisia just pulled out the questioned document and asked if he'd like to explain why the signature didn't match any of Dad's other signatures on file. The room went quiet, except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights. I sat there watching Mom perform her grief, while Mark cycled through anger and defensiveness, and something shifted in my chest. I wasn't angry anymore, just exhausted and ready for this to be over, so Dad and I could move forward. After 2 hours of back and forth, Mom's attorney suggested a restitution framework, and Artemisia countered with specific terms. We reached an agreement in principle where Mom and Mark would follow a payment schedule to pay back the documented stolen funds over time, contingent on what the investigations found. It wasn't everything we were owed, and there was no criminal admission, but Artemisia explained this gave us a legal framework, and we could still pursue other options if they didn't comply. I signed where she indicated, and walked out without looking at Mom, whose crying had gotten louder when she realized I wasn't going to forgive her. 2 days later, we were back in court for the asset freeze hearing. The judge was an older woman who read through Artemisia's motion while we waited, then asked Mom's attorney if he had any objections to a limited freeze on the disputed accounts. He argued it would cause hardship, but the judge cut him off and said the evidence showed clear risk of asset dissipation. She granted the freeze, preventing Mom and Mark from moving or hiding money while the investigations continued. It wasn't a full victory, but it was protection, and I was learning that legal progress happened in small procedural steps, not the dramatic courtroom moments I'd seen on TV. Walking out of the courthouse, Dad asked if we won, and I told him we got what we needed for now. That afternoon, Augusto called saying he found a HUD-VASH unit, a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood near bus lines and the VA clinic. We scheduled a viewing for the next morning, and I barely slept that night, too nervous that something would fall through. The apartment was on the second floor of a plain brick building with a small parking lot. Augusto met us outside and walked us through the unit, pointing out the working appliances and explaining the lease terms. The walls were clean and white, the bathroom had actual water pressure, and the bedroom had a window that let in real sunlight. I stood in the empty living room and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since my 18th birthday, this knot of fear and uncertainty finally starting to unwind. Dad walked through each room twice, touching the walls like he couldn't believe they were real. Augusto said we could move in within 2 weeks once the final paperwork cleared, and I signed the application right there on his clipboard. The caregiver program sent an acceptance email that evening, pending completion of the training modules. I pulled up the online portal and started working through the lessons about medication management and mobility assistance, and recognizing signs of distress. The training took 3 days to finish, but once I completed it, I'd receive a monthly stipend for helping Dad with daily activities and medical appointments. It wasn't much money, but it was reliable income, and more than that, it validated that taking care of Dad was real work, not just something I was supposed to do for free because he was family. Giovanni called the following week to say APS issued a preliminary letter of concern to Mom and Mark. The letter formally notified them that the investigation found substantiated evidence of financial exploitation of a disabled veteran. He was careful to explain this wasn't a final determination, but it was a significant finding that would support the criminal case and civil recovery efforts. I asked what happens next, and Giovanni said the full report would go to the DA's office for review, and they'd decide whether to file charges based on the evidence. Move-in day arrived on a Saturday morning. Dad and I packed our few belongings from the motel into trash bags and took the bus to the new apartment. Augusto met us there with the keys and helped carry stuff upstairs. Once he left, and it was just us in the empty space, Dad started pacing between the living room and bedroom. He kept asking what if the VA changed their mind, what if we couldn't afford it, what if Mom and Mark found us and caused trouble. His breathing got shallow and I recognized the signs of a panic attack building. I walked him to the couch and sat down next to him, guiding him through the breathing exercises Amelia taught me in therapy. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. We did it together until his shoulders relaxed and his hands stopped shaking. Then we unpacked slowly, turning the empty apartment into something that felt like ours, hanging Dad's few shirts in the closet and arranging our donated dishes in the kitchen cabinets. Agatha called Monday afternoon with an update about the bank investigation. She said they were issuing a larger provisional credit to my protected account based on their internal fraud findings. The amount would cover a significant portion of what was stolen from my college savings. She reminded me carefully that it was still provisional pending final determinations, but having actual money in an account that only I controlled felt like breathing after being underwater. I checked the balance 3 times that day, just to make sure it was real. Dad started seeing Victor Montes the following week. Victor was a VA psychiatrist who specialized in trauma, and his office was in the same building as the clinic where Dad got his other medical care. I waited in the lobby during the first appointment, flipping through old magazines and watching the clock. Dad came out an hour later looking tired but calmer. In the car, he told me Victor was straightforward about the work ahead, acknowledging both the combat trauma and the psychological damage from 12 years of wrongful hospitalization. Victor was optimistic about Dad's capacity for healing, which gave us both something we hadn't had in a long time: hope. The following week, I took the bus to the community college and found Cassie Vickers' office on the 2nd floor of the Student Services building. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, with a desk covered in forms and a coffee mug that said, "Deadline Survivor." I explained my situation without going into all the details, just that I was 18, responsible for my disabled veteran father, and needed to figure out college while managing his care. Cassie pulled up the fee waiver program on her computer and started clicking through requirements. She asked about my high school transcripts, and I told her they were still at my old address, but I could request copies. She made a note and then opened a course catalog, walking me through what a realistic first semester looked like for someone working part-time and caregiving. She suggested 2 classes to start, both online with flexible deadlines, and explained how the Disability Services Office could help if Dad had a crisis and I needed extensions. I felt my shoulders relax because she wasn't judging that I was starting late or that I couldn't handle a full load. She was just helping me build something that worked. We filled out the enrollment forms together, and she submitted my fee waiver application right there, saying it usually took 2 weeks to process. When I left her office, I had a printed course schedule for spring semester and a campus map with the financial aid office circled in red pen. Artemisia called 3 days later while I was helping Dad sort his medications into the weekly pill organizer. She said Mom's attorney reached out proposing that Mom and Mark would sell one of their cars to fund an initial restitution payment. The amount would be around $8,000, showing good faith compliance with the settlement agreement. I felt my jaw tighten, because any gesture from them felt like manipulation, but Artemisia was already talking through the terms. She said she'd negotiated that the payment had to go directly into the restitution escrow account, not to us, and they needed to provide the bill of sale and deposit confirmation within 30 days. I asked if this meant they were actually taking responsibility, and Artemisia's voice got careful. She said it meant they were following the agreement to avoid further legal action, which wasn't the same as remorse, but it was compliance. I told her I'd accept the payment once it was verified in writing, and she said she'd send me copies of everything. After we hung up, I explained it to Dad, and he just nodded slowly, his hands still on the pill bottles. He said he didn't care about their reasons as long as the money came back. 2 weeks later, I was carrying groceries up to the apartment when I saw Mark's truck in the parking lot. My stomach dropped and I stopped walking, bags still in my hands. He was sitting in the driver's seat about 50 feet from our building, engine off, just staring at the windows. I turned around immediately and walked back toward the street, pulling out my phone. I called 911 and told the dispatcher there was a restraining order violation in progress, gave them the address and Mark's license plate number. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and move to a safe location. I went around the corner to the bus stop and waited, watching the parking lot entrance. A police car arrived within 10 minutes, and I saw the officer approach Mark's truck. Mark started gesturing and pointing, but the officer wasn't having it. They talked for a few minutes, and then the officer walked Mark to the patrol car. I gave my statement to a second officer who arrived, showed him the restraining order paperwork on my phone, and confirmed Mark had no legitimate reason to be at our address. The officer said they were arresting Mark for violation, and I'd receive a court date notification for the hearing. The hearing happened the following week, and I sat in the courtroom watching Mark try to explain to the judge that he was just driving through the neighborhood. The prosecutor presented the police report, the GPS data from the 911 call showing I was at the apartment complex when I called, and photos the officer took off Mark's truck parked in our lot. The judge looked at Mark and said this was a clear violation of a protective order and asked if he understood that the order existed specifically to prevent this kind of contact. Mark started to argue, but his attorney put a hand on his arm. The judge extended the restraining order to a full year and added a warning that any further violations would result not just in arrest, but in jail time pending trial. For the first time since this started, I felt like the legal system was actually taking our safety seriously, not just processing paperwork. I left the courthouse and texted Artemisia the outcome, and she responded with a thumbs-up emoji and, good. The VA letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a thick envelope with official seals. I opened it at the kitchen table and read the first paragraph 3 times before the words actually registered. The representative payee change was finalized, and I now had legal authority to manage Dad's benefits. The letter included instructions for the transition, contact information for the benefits coordinator, and a checklist of responsibilities. I sat there holding the pages and feeling the weight of what this meant. Dad's financial security was in my hands now, not Mom's, not Mark's, not some stranger at the VA who never checked if he was okay. I was responsible for making sure his bills got paid, his medications were covered, his basic needs were met. It was overwhelming, but it was also right, and I felt grateful that after 12 years of exploitation, someone finally trusted me to do what should have been done all along. I walked into the living room where Dad was watching the news and showed him the letter. He read it slowly, and then looked up at me with wet eyes and said, "Thank you." The first caregiver stipend payment hit my account on the 15th of the month. I was checking my phone during Dad's doctor appointment when the deposit notification popped up. I stared at the screen for a full minute, reading the amount and the description line that said, VA Caregiver Support Program. It was small, only a few $100s, but it was reliable income that would come every month. Combined with Dad's benefits that I now controlled properly, we could actually budget for rent and food and basic stability without constant crisis. I showed Dad the notification when we got back to the car, and he squeezed my shoulder. On the way home, we stopped at the grocery store, and I bought actual fresh vegetables instead of just ramen and canned soup, and it felt like a luxury, even though it was just normal food that normal people bought. Agatha called the next week to confirm the restitution escrow received its first payment from the car sale. She walked me through the deposit details and verified the amount matched what Mom's attorney had promised. She was careful to remind me that my provisional credits from the bank were still pending final determination based on their fraud investigation, but having money actually flowing back felt like tangible progress. It wasn't justice, and it wasn't everything we lost, but it was something real, something I could point to and say, they're actually paying consequences. I asked Agatha what happened next, and she said the bank investigation was still ongoing, but this restitution payment strengthened our case because it showed Mom and Mark acknowledged the debt. She said she'd keep me updated, and I thanked her for everything she'd done. Dad and I sat down that evening and made a decision about boundaries. We agreed we wouldn't have any contact with Mom or Mark unless it went through our attorneys, and we were going to actually stick to it this time. I blocked Mom's number and Mark's number and any other numbers I recognized from their side of the family. Over the next few weeks, Mom tried calling from different numbers, and I didn't answer. Mark's sister reached out on social media asking if we could talk, and I blocked her. Mark's brother sent a message saying I was tearing the family apart, and I deleted it without responding. Every time I held that boundary, instead of caving to guilt or curiosity, I felt a little bit stronger. The consistency of not engaging created a calm I didn't know was possible, like I could finally breathe without waiting for the next manipulation or crisis. 3 months after I woke up to cold water on my face, I was sitting at our kitchen table with Dad's evening medications laid out in front of me. The apartment smelled like the cheap chicken and rice I had in the oven, and my laptop was open to my community college syllabus for the online writing class I'd started the week before. Dad was in the living room watching some cooking show, and I heard him laugh at something the host said. I looked around at the small space we'd made ours, the thrift store couch, the donated dishes in the cabinet, the VA appointment reminder stuck to the fridge with a magnet. This quiet domestic moment, this ordinary Thursday evening with medications and dinner and homework, this was what stability actually looked like. Not dramatic or exciting, just solid and predictable and safe. I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect now, because it's not. We're still in therapy, still dealing with legal proceedings, still learning how to be father and son after 12 years apart. Dad still has nightmares and panic attacks, and I still get angry about the childhood they stole from us. But we have a home with our names on the lease. We have food in the fridge that we bought with money no one can steal, and we have a plan for what comes next that we built ourselves. That's not a happy ending where everything wraps up neat and everyone lives happily ever after. It's something better. It's a solid beginning. Well, that was a journey through the worst parenting decisions ever made. If you're sitting there thinking your family's complicated, at least they probably didn't fake anyone's death. Probably. Anyway, subscribe if you want more stories that start terrible and end with a tiny sliver of hope. And hey, if you learned anything today, maybe it's that the legal system occasionally works. Shocking, I know. All right, I'm out.